Todd. Thank you. Guys, as Todd just said, my name is Brady Basner. I'm the sales manager with Powermaster Performance. What we're going to talk about today, really just some basic troubleshooting stuff that we see. We do nothing but starters and alternators. That's all we've done for 33 years. It's what we live and breathe every day, so we want to hopefully bring some of that expertise to what you guys are doing on a daily basis, building cars, selling parts, really in any way we can help. What we're really going to focus on, though, is just obviously starting and charging problems. That's really all we do, but some of the more common issues that we see. So to get started, we'll do it this way. First off, we're going to talk about proper part selection. That's really where we feel getting the right part on the right vehicle for the right application is really half the battle. You see a lot of high dollar street rods running around with OE style alternators on, the 42 amp Delco alternator on a car with twin cooling fans and brake coolers and stereo system, and it just doesn't cut it. So we want to go over some of that. Some of the common issues that we see when everything's on there and working as it should and things maybe don't go right. We're going to talk about some of what we see there, and then some of the resolution to those problems. You know, as I said, we've been doing this for 33 years, but also outside of the starter and alternator world, we live and breathe hot rods every day. You know, I've got a 49 F1 pickup. The owner's got several vehicles. Everybody from the top down in the company is a hot rod guy, you know, and we really like to focus on that. When somebody calls into our tech line, you know, if you've got a Fiat Topolino with a blown alcohol motor, we get it. We know what you're working on. We always kind of laugh with the guys that call in and say, you know, I've got an 89 Caprice with a small block Chevy. No, you don't. You got a 32 Ford with a small block in. We get it. And, you know, we always have that laugh. But so we want to be basically your starter and alternator experts because we do that part of it every day. But again, we understand what you guys are working on too. First off, who is Powermaster? We are a USA manufacturer of high-performance starters and alternators, as Todd mentioned. We've been building product in West Chicago since 1981. The Powermaster brand came along in about 92. So we've done work with Ford, you know, Ford Motor Company. I'm obviously sure you've heard of Ford. We did OE work with them for a long time. The Gravedigger monster trucks, Richard Petty Driving School, things that we've worked very closely with. Obviously, we've been doing it a long time, but the partners that we work with have helped us develop a better product in that, you know, the Gravedigger guys are going to be a lot harder on a starter than a guy running a stock Ford pickup. We see the whole range of it, and it's really helped us develop some really phenomenal pieces. We've usually got right around 105 people. Usually during the winter, we have a few drop off, a few people retired just recently. But more importantly, we have a full-time tech and sales support department. You guys should all have my business card there that has our tech line number on it, as well as my email. We want to be available as much as possible for any questions that you have. We're going to go over, again, some of the common issues, things that don't fall in with those issues, things that don't make sense, things you need help with. Please don't hesitate to give us a call. We're never going to judge anybody for some of the simple questions. We appreciate our customers and we have respect for our customers. We appreciate what you guys are out there doing every day. So we want to be there to support you the best we can. We are an industry leader in research and development. A good example, the Richard Petty Driving School cars. This is something very different than even a standard race car is going to use. You look at a Nextel Cup or Winston Cup car or whatever they're called this week, you know, a 3 or 4 hour race on a Sunday afternoon is a lot different than running a car all day on a Saturday. Letting guys that are learning how to essentially race and live out their dreams drive a car around the track for 6 or 8 hours a day is much different than that car is even going to behave in a race environment. So we actually developed some very specific parts for Petty that has come into our street use. We've got a brand new catalog, almost 400 new part numbers, and a lot of those are what we see in some mandated type of things out of the industry, what we see going to car shows, what we see coming to the races. With that, we'll jump right into proper selection. Now, we had a customer call one day and he started talking about when he goes over how to pick an alternator for one of his customers, he likes to use the ABCs. And we honestly kind of thought that was maybe an oversimplified thing, and maybe he was looking at it a little too easily, but it really made a lot of sense when he went through it, because first off, you always start with the amperage requirements. This is totally non-negotiable. This is something you can't fake. If you've got 150 amps worth of draw and you put a 50 amp alternator on it, it is not going to survive. It could be the best alternator in the world. It's just not going to put out what that vehicle is asking for. Where we see this a lot, and this kind of moves into the brackets used, but where we see this a lot is, you look at some of the Riddler type of cars. Guys want to hide an alternator. I've had some of these guys where you want to put an alternator on a rear differential, like the dirt track racers do, and it does not work for the street. I've seen plenty of cars where guys build it, it looks cool, it does not work like it should, and the car does not get driven. So, amp requirements, you sit down and you make a list of all the electrical components on a vehicle. When you come up with that list, that's kind of set in stone. You've got 80 amps, 100 amps worth of draw. You need an alternator that's going to cover that load. Next is going to be brackets used, and that can be as simple as Ford, Chevy. You got a March bracket, Billet Specialties, Zoops, any of the number of custom brackets. You're making your own brackets. Where do you want to fit that alternator into? Now, we've got some really unique solutions for that we'll cover in a minute, but for the most part, you're looking at just Ford, Chevy. Here's the type of vehicle I'm looking to put it on. Also, what type of vehicle? Is it a race car? Is it a dirt track car? Or is it a $3 million grade 8 or Riddler contender car? What you're actually doing with that car. Is it a race car, or is it a car that you're still going to drive to work during the week? The Fox Body Mustang guys for years, they were sold those underdrive pulley kits that promised 15 horsepower. And, it was great for the track, and you maybe got a little power at the track, but to try to drive it to work or school during the week, as soon as you pull up to a stoplight, things are not working like they should. So what the car is realistically used for is also very good to consider. And finally, the wiring used. I always like to throw this in there because we did an article with Marlon Davis with Hot Rod Magazine a few months ago where he was working on a customer's 65 El Camino. The guy had cooling issues, and he put dual cooling fans on to help the issue. That, of course, required a higher amperage alternator. They used one of ours. They used one of our 150 amp 12 SI alternators and immediately damaged it. Immediately, they had smoke coming out of it. Things weren't working like they should. So I was talking to the guys doing the work on it and started asking some questions what they were doing, and they said, well, we didn't want to use it as a one wire, so we plugged in the voltage regulator plug in the back. You dive into it a little bit further. Well, what kind of wiring harnesses? Where do those wires go? They had no idea where the wiring went that plugged into the side of that alternator, and it actually damaged the alternator. I do always prefer to run an alternator as a one wire whenever possible. Unless it's got an American Auto Wire, a Painless, a Ron Francis, any of the number of harnesses where where those wires are going to, a stock wiring harness. For the most part, all you're losing if you don't plug in the alternator is the dummy light on the dash, the charge indicator light. Now, we also have a really unique situation for that, is we have a dual purpose regulator on almost all of our line. You can run it as a one wire or run it as an OE hookup, but most importantly, as a one wire, the things that guys were always scared about, I don't want to have to rev up my engine. I don't want an alternator that's not going to charge at idle. Those are not things that you're getting with a Powermaster alternator. Our turn-on speed right now is only about 1,600 RPM at the shaft of the alternator. So if you consider stock pulley ratios, that's about a 500 engine RPM. So you don't have to rev up the engine. Our 150 amp alternator, the guys at Hot Rod, the one they were using, charges almost 100 amps at idle. So you're cruising around at Kalamazoo or Louisville or sitting in traffic for hours on Woodward during the summer. You do not have to worry about that alternator dropping down and your voltage suffering. So I do like to run it as a one wire, but again, we do have the options for people that are set against it. Now, I mentioned we had a unique solution for somebody looking for certain brackets. We have our power gen. Now, our power gen in its most simplest term is a one-wire alternator that looks like a generator. You're talking the pre-64 vehicles, Chevy, Ford, Chrysler. Most of the Chrysler stuff use the Delco generator. Guys, you'll see a lot of these out there on the floor. A lot of the cars are going to be running the power gen. It's got the right look, well over 3 times the output, half the weight of a stock generator. So it's a pretty simple upgrade for guys looking to keep that that traditional look, and yet they need the power. So going back to what we were talking about with brackets, I've got a 364 Buick nailhead motor. $200 or so into Allen Grove brackets to put an alternator on it, $150 into an alternator, and I'm right about where a power gen is going to cost, and it doesn't look right. It's going to run a 57 motor with a, say a 70s style alternator, and it just kills the whole look of a nailhead. The flathead's another good example. People aren't generally running flatheads for their power. It's all for the look. You want to keep the look as it should. So we definitely have some options as far as bracketry and still keeping the amp requirements. We've got quick guides how to select the correct one. Again, it all comes down to the first step is proper selection. On the back of my business card, the web link that we have down there has all of our technical bulletins. We'll go over a few of them, but things like the power gen selection, we have some great information in our new catalog, but we also have some individual sheets that are very specific to a certain product. Guys have any questions or anything on selection? And please feel free to just raise your hand if you have anything, and smart aleck questions are always encouraged.
Oh, I got one. Power gen alternator for the power gen, is that start charging at the low RPM?
Yes, yeah, just like any of ours, it's about 1600 shaft RPM. Where that's interesting is the flatheads generally had a real small crank pulley. So a guy running a flathead, they're generally worried about not having that low end output. Also, a flathead's going to idle really low too. So, you're keeping the look. Generally, guys that were taking a generator off, which charged at very low RPM, would have problems putting a factory alternator on. So you put a factory GM style alternator, they don't charge at low end. So yet another benefit of using something that we're able to do. On to some common issues. When we're done here too, I've got a box full of parts. We get into the plant, things that we see every day that are some creative uses for our products, some neat things people have done and maybe not turned out as well as they'd intended. But as we talked about, improper selection is probably one of our #1 issues. Just getting too small of an alternator, not the right alternator, just in the end, not the right pieces for what they're trying to do. The second, and this is a big one across starters and alternators, is improper grounds. We mentioned some brackets there. Allen Grove. Allen Grove's going to sell you a bare steel bracket. So you're going to paint them. You're going to powder coat them. March brackets, they're all clear coated. A lot of guys don't think, well, it's a one-wire alternator. All I need is the one wire. Well, but the alternator grounds through the housing. So a lot of times, on a car where you don't want a lot of wires, you want everything cleaned up, you want it to look real nice. Grounds sometimes do suffer because of that. The same goes for a starter. We get things in the plant all the time for repair where, you get a Chevy starter and you've got 8 layers of the Eastwood Chevy orange paint on it. The guy put a brand new, freshly painted motor in his car, tried to bolt that starter up through all that layers of paint, and they just don't function like they should. A lot of times they will function for a while. They'll work at a very diminished capacity, and they'll just generally see an overall shortened life. Battery, people ask all the time, what kind of battery do we recommend? There's a lot of really good high quality batteries out there, and that's about all I can say on batteries. Don't skimp on a battery. Don't get the cheap one from a parts store. Any good quality battery, Excess Power, Optima, Odyssey, there's a lot of them out there, but they do need to be maintained. And that's the thing that gets missed quite a bit, especially around here. If a car doesn't get driven from September to May and it sits all winter and you might get started once or twice, that battery's discharging all winter. You've got maybe just that little clock radio that's running off battery power. It's drawing the battery down. 12-volt battery really needs to be at about 12.6 to be properly charged. You put a meter on it, says 11.9, and you think, yeah, it's a 12-volt battery, that's close enough. You start up the car, that alternator is working 100% as hard as it can until that battery is fully charged. An alternator is meant to maintain a battery, not to charge it. We've got some good examples of completely burnt stators, just literally burnt and melted wire from the heat that's provided or produced when a battery is discharged or low. Battery tenders, C-Tech chargers, there's all sorts of battery maintainers out there that'll keep both the battery alive a lot longer, but also the starter and alternator alive a lot longer. The guys at Optima will tell you if a battery's 12.2, it's only 25% charged. And that tends to shock a lot of people, but we'll tell them if you're troubleshooting an alternator or a starter, if that battery's anything less than 12.6, put it on the charger and let's talk again after it's fully charged. An undersized battery, this is another thing that when we talk to alternators, just too small of an alternator, too small of a starting battery. You've got a big diesel plow truck and you really want that little neat, 925 style battery in there. It's just not going to provide the cranking power. When it does, if it does start the vehicle, that's again asking the alternator to do a lot of work to try to charge that battery up. So just a good quality battery, keep it maintained, keep it on that battery tender. It's just a long, happy life for all your electrical items. Proper charge wire. Now we see this in a lot of different areas. Every year at Louisville, the Street Rod Nationals, we have our tech tent. We have a little tent set up outside where we have people come up, we check out their starters, check out their alternators. We unfortunately see a lot of suspect wiring. Some of the names I mentioned earlier, American Auto Wire, Ron Francis, Painless, they're certainly worth the money if you've not wired a car, but if you're not sure on the proper gauge of wires, the proper quality of wires. I know we just got one in the plant. A guy used some household electrical wire as the charge wire for his alternator. Completely cooked most of his electrical system, unfortunately. A good high quality stranded wire. Bigger is always better when it comes to wire. Amperage is going to travel over the surface area of a wire. So you're looking for a nice fine stranded wire, bigger size, a lot of wire essentially. The more surface area you can get, the more efficiently the electrical items are going to run. Belt tension is probably our #1 issue on alternators. We see this for a few reasons. One is higher amperage alternators take more torque to turn. So you've got a 68 Camaro, you take off the 42 amp Delco piece, you put on a 150 amp Powermaster, it's physically going to take more effort to turn at higher amperage levels. The more amperage you're requiring out of an alternator, the harder it is to turn, and the more propensity for some belt slip. This just far and above. Again, I've got some things here we can show you. The power gen, that's a big one where guys taking off a 25 amp generator and putting on a 90 amp alternator are not prepared for running the belt at a proper tension. Then let alone the poor quality belts out there. You change a water pump, change an alternator, change a power steering pump, put a new belt on it. An old belt that you found in the garage, some of the cheap part store stuff, they stretch, they're not the correct width, they're just flat out not doing the job. As I mentioned with the power gen, alternators require more belt tension than the generators. The flathead guys, they're really nervous about hurting their water pumps. There's great water pumps out there. You can talk to the guys at Speedway or Edelbrock. They've got really great stuff with high quality bearings in them. There's really no excuse not for running proper belt tension and worrying about anything else on the car. Alignment is another issue. Custom brackets, aftermarket brackets. If that belt's not aligned properly, it's just not going to grip as it should. The Gates, the Delco or the Dayco websites have really neat videos on how to look for proper belt tension, what signs of proper belt tension or proper belt alignment. We've got a tech bulletin. We've got some here and we've got them on our website for what we're looking for as far as the alternator is concerned on proper belt tension. Dayco, I know, has the little nifty little Cricut belt tension gauge. It's just a little, like an $8 tool you put on your finger and it pretty accurately tells you the proper belt tension on a belt. Far and above though, across the whole line of alternators, belt slip is the biggest reason we see for failure, for premature alternator failure basically. It's really just, I'm trying to find the words for it, to be honest with you. I had David Freiberger from Hot Rod called me and he says, we're doing an article on tech issues. What's your biggest tech issue? And I said, improperly tensioned belts by far. And he said, well, what's the solution? I said, tighten your belt. And he kind of paused for a second. He goes, I was looking for some sort of magic, like this thing that only the tech guys know. I said, it's just, Dave, just run the belt tighter. I said, if I could get most of our customers to run the belt tighter, that would eliminate almost all of our tech issues on alternators. It's really that simple on that side. Do you guys have any questions on alternators? Excellent. That's literally everything I know about alternators, so I'm glad you didn't ask anything. On to starters. Again, proper selection, high compression engines, high initial timing, hot start issues, all reasons for a good high torque starter. Page 9 of our catalog, we have this nifty chart that shows basically how much compression do you have in the motor. Here's the level of starter you're looking for. We have anything up to 18-to-1 compression engines, and I have guys I know running engines with even more than that are running our style starters. Alcohol motors, crank triggers, magnetos. You need faster flywheel RPM. We've got a specific starter for that. For the most part, though, if you're talking street rod, hot rod, muscle car, we've got our XS torque line of starters. It's our most complete from end to end model of starter. We've got models from early Cadillacs to Jeeps and Burt Bryn dirt racing style starters. We've really got just about everything for your hot rod or race car. Now, the question I always get, especially on the Chevy starters, are, am I going to need to shim this starter? I'm calling up Summit or Jegs, or I'm going to my local parts store, I'm going to Mancini Racing, I'm spending $250 on a starter. Am I going to have to shim it? Because I'm spending a lot of money now. I don't want to have to shim this starter. I can tell you to the precision that our starters are made, that the blocks are machined. I cannot tell you about the flywheel that you got from your brother-in-law's shed. I can't tell you about that block that you bought at the swap meet. Chevy motors had 126 different casting numbers. They're all over the place. I mean, you can take one starter, put it on 3 different engines, and the shimming can be completely different. We do include bolts and shims with our starters for a reason. They need to be used, they need to be checked. Taking 5 or 10 minutes to look at the shimming on a starter is easily worth 10 or 15 years on the life of the starter. Putting it on and trying to see how it sounds, if it sounds right, if it sounds a little tight, you got to get under there. Now, we've got some good information. We've got a video, how to check for proper shimming on a starter. We sprung for a really nifty tool for you guys too. On all the catalogs there's a tool holding my card to the catalog. It's a paper clip is all you need to check the shimming on a starter. Engage that starter gear, put the paper clip in there as a feeler gauge. You're looking for about 25 to 35 thousandths clearance. Again, I can't stress enough, the time it takes to shim a starter is worth easily the life of a starter. Now, we talked about our power gen. We've got a very unique solution for the early flathead starters as well. We've got our vintage torque style starter. This is basically a gear reduction high torque starter, half the weight, 75% more cranking power than a factory starter. It's meant to look the part of a factory flathead starter. I mentioned that we go to Louisville, we go back to the 50s, we go to Columbus every year. You're looking at a flathead car, you're looking at a Model A with a no hood sides, it's got the power gen, it's got the right look. And then you look down and see the little Nip and Denso style high torque starter. Now, guys at H&H Flatheads, they swear by it. They love the mini starters. It's like pulling teeth to get them to use anything different. They're so in love with that starter. But you're putting a flathead in the car for the look. It's got to look a certain way. It's a period correct. You got to have the vintage torque starter to complete the look. Like I said, another really unique solution. Not just a cookie cutter type of operation here. We're looking at what guys are doing, what types of cars are out there, and who we want to service. And this was kind of something people were asking us for. Now, on to some common starter issues. As with the alternators, improper selection and grounds. Two huge issues on any electrical item. The mounting surface on any starter, again, they ground just like an alternator. They ground through the body. So they're going to ground when you bolt them up to the engine block, when you bolt them to the bell housing. I personally do like to run a dedicated ground connection directly to a starter or an alternator, through the mounting bolts, directly to the mounting surface. Nothing's going to be quite as efficient as running a ground directly to that mounting surface. Improper battery grounds are a big issue. I'll pick on the Fox body guys again, any of the unibody cars, but the Fox bodies especially, it was really popular to put the battery in the trunk of the car. And then guys would run the ground cable just basically right to the sheet metal back in the trunk. When you're trying to start that car, when you're trying to use that battery power, we talked about amperage travels over the surface area of a wire. Well, if you're grounding the sheet metal, it's traveling over the whole surface area of that car to try to get down to that starter when you're cranking. Low battery voltage to the starter is going to result in burnt solenoid contacts. The gear is going to want to walk in and out. It'll wear on a clutch assembly. It can actually kick back and completely damage a clutch assembly. It can knock teeth off a flywheel. And again, we're talking tenths of a volt sometimes. The difference between a 12.2 battery and a 12.6 is a world of difference. What really happens, not just on the alternator side or on the starter side, is low voltage will actually increase the heat moving across the solenoid contacts. You'll see melted contacts, you'll see burnt contacts. During cranking, that amperage is just going to want to jump up to basically complete the circuit, to carry that load. Improper shimming. We talked about the block shims, but a gear reduction starter, you also need to be considering how far out the gear goes. When that starter starts the engine, that gear's got to get out of the flywheel pretty quick to basically keep from damaging itself. Not only do our starters include the bolts and the block shims, but they do include those inner shims. You only want about 50% of the gear engagement, so that gear gets out of Dodge pretty quick. Improper installation, use the proper knurled bolts. Try not to have more than probably 6 or 7 beers before you're actually putting the starter on. Wintertime, that gets a little tough, but you got to keep it down a little bit. Broken terminal connections, I see this a lot with our fleet mechanics. We have a line of diesel starters, and the fleet mechanics are doing trucks just in and out basically as quickly as they can. They'll use air tools on electrical connections and snap them. They're pretty sensitive. They're meant to be an insulator between the alternator and starter housing and the actual electrical connections themselves. So no air tools or power tools on electrical connections. I'm pretty sure the guys at MSD or whoever sold you your car stereo, they're probably going to tell you the same thing as far as any electrical connections. So here's our picture, some of the internal parts that we include with our starters. The bolts that we use, a Chevy style bolt, the engine block on a Chevy actually has a little bit of a taper to the bolt hole. The knurling on the bolt is actually going to seat into the engine block to keep that starter from moving around during cranking. So it is really important to use the proper knurled bolts. It includes the shims, and the funny shaped shim on the left hand side, that's one of the block shims along with that round one up at the top. And that's going to move that gear essentially further away. We're going to jump into some kind of graphic pictures here, so I hope everybody's all right with that. Just turn away if anything's hard to look at here. This is an alternator that we got into our plant here. This is somebody did not disconnect the battery prior to installation. Again, anybody that's selling you electrical items is going to tell you that disconnect the battery before you're putting anything on. This actually looks like some impromptu welding occurred to the back of the case, literally just melting the aluminum around the charge post. Here's a good example of a burnt stator. That's supposed to be a nice shiny orange copper color, and not the black. That is literally just burnt copper. That's an alternator that was working so hard to keep up with its load, it completely burnt itself. We get these into the plant, and you can open up the box and immediately smell it. You know, you smell that burnt varnish and insulation from those copper wires. Now, loose belt, I've had some people ask me on stuff like this, but if an alternator's belt is slipping, it is not charging as it should be. It's not putting out what the alternator's expected to do. Now, absolutely everybody in this room, I can feel confident in saying, has heard in the wintertime in Michigan, you hear somebody start up their truck and you hear that belt squeal, and it'll last for a few seconds and then eventually grab. You're using so much power out of the battery when it's cold outside that the torque it takes to turn the alternator is increased. So once that belt grabs, that alternator is pretty much putting out as much as it can. So you end up with some burnt stators. A lot of people don't really take seriously what a loose belt can do to the internals of an alternator. So that's a good example right there. Again, not supposed to look like that. Bad battery, again, it's asking the alternator to cover too much of the load. And then poor connections. In the previous picture there, you know, the melted case on the back of the alternator, if everything the alternator is trying to put out isn't getting where it needs to go, you're going to see an increased load on the alternator. You've got too small of a wire. Basically, the alternator is trying to breathe through a little straw. It's trying to force as much amperage as it can through a small little wire. It's just going to kill itself in the process. Now, here's a good example of one of the pulleys that we've had where belt slip has occurred. I mean, they'll literally turn black. You'll see the insides of the groove start to turn black. The pulley itself will heat up on a chrome piece. You'll see the chrome start to flake and discolor. The heat generated through a pulley that's had a belt slip in is just immense. It can be a ton instantly. People will call and ask, well, you know, my alternator is really hot. When I open my hood and I can see it, I can see the heat waves coming off it. If I touch it or put the gun on it, it's just extremely hot. The majority of the time, that heat is just created through the belt slip and will heat up that rotor shaft so much it'll permeate through the entire case of the alternator. The alternator in that case acts essentially like a big heat sink. It's just an aluminum case on there. And that's what you end up seeing. This is a good example of how hot that pulley can get to discolor that solid steel shaft there, turn it blue and purple. Now, the only issue I ever really have with bearings is when they become this hot, you'll see grease actually wick out of the bearings. I'll see more bearing problems because of a loose belt than an over-tightened belt. I can't think of the last time I've even seen a bearing that was damaged because of an over-tightened belt, but we do certainly see it with a loose belt. Now, with all this too, it bears note that these are all things that come into our plant that we fix. You know, we do have our warranty. We do have a year warranty from essentially date of install. We like to do it, but we fix things that are several years old. Things that are damaged during races, damaged in the mud and water. It's just a matter of box it up, send it to our plant, put a name, address, and phone number on. We'll be into it for usually just parts cost. You know, I've had things that come in that several years old, 30, 40, 50 bucks worth of parts, a little bit of shipping, back to your door, you've essentially got a brand new product. So, you know, I don't want to sound like these are issues that we're stuck with, because in the worst case scenario, if you guys have customers, if you've seen things, if you buy a car and stuff's not working like it should, we absolutely want to help out. So again, these are all things that have come into our plant and have been repaired or been handled in other issues. There are some things that are just too far gone, and I've got some examples of those, but again, call us up and we want to help whenever we can. Now, this is a really kind of unique issue. This is somebody that changed the pulley on their alternator, and with an impact gun, if you don't do it properly, and again, we've got a tech bulletin on our website that shows the correct way, but you can actually drive the bearings out of the back of the alternator, as you can see on the left. Now, what that does is when you look at the slip rings on the right, the brushes that ride on those slip rings, those are the only two things that really come in contact with the spinning rotor. Those were not in the center like they should have been. You can see kind of the marks in the center, and then you can see the marks off to the left. This will significantly shorten the life of an alternator. It'll damage that bearing in the back. You'll burn up the brushes on the slip rings. Again, something we can fix, but a completely avoidable issue on the front end. Here's another example of a loose battery cable, something that was connected to a hot battery. This one more than likely was a loose battery cable. You can kind of see how the burn marks around the rectifier in the back there. It looks like the cable was actually vibrating against something and just shorting out. Every time it loses contact, you just get arc marks and burning. This is an example of probably a misaligned belt on this. This is what we call our fan baffle, and it goes on the front of the fan behind the pulley. It actually creates more airflow through an alternator. It sucks more air across the stator windings. But in this case, the misalignment, it was actually rubbing against the belt. Now, if that wasn't there, you'd have seen the same marks against the fan, but that misalignment more than likely caused some belt slip. Obviously, the marking on the front of the baffle here, but again, significantly suffering alternator. Now, onto the starters. This one is kind of hard to see. Ideally, we mentioned that the starter gear should only go about halfway into the flywheel or ring gear. So that marking, that shiny spot should only go about 50%, no more than about 2/3 the length down there. So in this customer's case, it was coming almost completely down to the end of the starter gear. Every time that engine started, that gear didn't get out of the way quick enough, and it went for probably about 11 times faster than it should. Little ride every time that engine started. You'll see some wear on the edge of the teeth, but you'll damage that clutch assembly. Pretty soon the gear will come out, it'll engage the flywheel, the starter motor will spin, you'll hear like a zinging sound, but the engine won't start. A lot of people think that's a bad starter, a bad solenoid or something. When you can actually get down there and see how it's engaging in the ring gear, it's just a flat out slipping clutch assembly. Here's the solenoid contacts on a Denso style starter. Those are not supposed to be melted right there. That's supposed to be a solid piece of copper. We see this in a couple reasons. Either high voltage, guys running 24 volts to a starter, or low voltage. In the low voltage, you'll see some excessive amperage on there, and you can actually see this copper start to pool and melt. Usually the early symptoms are just a black mark and then almost like a rust looking mark on the solenoid contacts. Every time that contact goes to meet the solenoid plunger, you get a little bit of an air gap. It'll kind of flutter along there, and you'll get those gaps and sparks, and eventually you'll get a melted contact like that. We mentioned and also here's what the contacts really should look like. And it's got a nice even wear on there. Here's a good example of an over-tightened connection. There's the little wire that comes through there to the ignition contact. We do really everything we can to epoxy these, we weld them so that they do not move. With enough torque, anything can of course break. That's what happened here, is just that wire to the ignition contact broke. Simple enough, just over-tightened connection. This one we're still trying to figure out. I've got guys that have been in the plant for, again, 30-some years. They can't know possibly everything, but this one actually came back from one of our big retailers as an out-of-the-box defect. Now, we're pretty sure that wasn't the case, but what we do to avoid any of those types of issues, because we do have customers that say, look, I bought the alternator. When I pull it out, I put it on the car, it just didn't work. Every single one of our alternators comes with a proof of performance tag. It comes right on the charge post. It's thoroughly dyno tested. It tells you who tested it, what the amperage output was, what the amperage output was at idle. This is not a claim of performance. This isn't a sticker that says 100 amp. This is an absolute guarantee that this is what this alternator did on our dyno test. The same thing with starters. And our starter guy, our guy Dave, has been with us a long time. He is absolutely through and through an engineer. Now, his dyno sheets on the starters, you almost have to be an engineer to understand it at some points. He gets really into kilowatt ratings and kilowatt ratings at certain voltage levels. But again, they are tested. Here's the proof that they were tested. We can guarantee the performance of this product. Now, that eliminates any of the out-of-the-box issues. That eliminates sitting at home on a Friday night. You know, you're working on the car, you've got some free time. We don't want you putting on a product that's not going to work for you. We don't want you cruising Woodward with an alternator that is not going to keep up with your amperage demands and puts you at the side of the road. We want to absolutely make the best product that we can, but we're enthusiasts as well. We know what it's like to be let down by a product that didn't live up to expectations. Now, what I love about something like this is obviously a guy that was off-roading. I hope it was somebody that was at least intentionally off-roading. We get them fixed up. You know, this is a customer we call up and say, look, your alternator is completely full of mud and water. There's really nothing much we can do with this. Let's work out, you know, we've got a repaired product in the factory. Let's get you something new. You know, we know that you buy your products through Mancini Racing. Let's work something out and get something going. We really want to help you stay out there, stay out on the trail, stay out on the track or on the road and enjoy your vehicle like it's meant to. That is, at the end of the day, the most important thing for us. Again, somebody that we can get fixed up. Hopefully, if you guys have any issues, if anything comes up, we want to get you fixed up. Let us help. Call us, email us, come talk to us at the shows. We are over, what was our booth number we decided? 1431. Come see us, please. You know, we've got the stickers and posters and all the neat stuff that we like to play around with. We want to talk about your cars. That's why we come to shows. So, most importantly, though, I appreciate you guys having us here, and we appreciate you coming and wanting to learn a little bit about what we do every day. Is there any other questions or complaints or concerns? Yes, sir.
You mentioned belt plating a couple times on the elevator.
Yes.
You know, you start read in manuals the longest point on a V belt, which has a 1-inch flex. Is that the way you still recommend tightening down a belt?
Do we recommend tightening a belt between the longest stretch? So say if it's from, that's just a lot of variance on them. Because again, you're talking about you know, Delco made a 42 amp alternator. With that alternator, the belt could be a lot looser than, you know, you got a high volume water pump, a high amp alternator. The belt tension is more critical. That's just too vague of a recommendation from what we've seen. So is it 4 inches between the water pump and the alternator, or is it 4 3/4? You know, because it could be a big difference. Is it a serpentine or a V-pulley? It's just, there's a lot of variance that we see on that. You know, I've got a Jeep, and the Jeep guys say that on a serpentine belt, you should be able to twist it to almost vertical on the plane, and that's kind of how all the Jeep guys do it. I've not found that that's even proper belt tension for the high amp alternator. I run mine quite a bit tighter. Really the best thing to do, you know, there's the gauges. I've got a neat little gauge I'll show you. That's really the easiest way to do it, and just get it right the first time. So, thank you. Anybody else? Guys, again, I very much appreciate you having me and coming out today, and we will be here all weekend, so please come by the booth and we'd love to talk to you some more. All right, thank you.